Billionaire finds boy at son's grave. What happens next will shock you. A story that will leave you speechless. What happens in the middle of it completely changes the ending. We'd love to know what city you're watching this video from. Leave us a comment. While you're here, make sure to subscribe to our channel, hit that like button, and turn on the notification bell to stay updated on all of our content. The day had barely begun, and yet João Batista could feel the weight of the hours pressing down on him. His sprawling mansion, a testament to his years of hard work and the empire he had built, felt like a distant, lifeless place today. The luxurious surroundings, the opulent furniture, the gleaming marble floors, it all seemed so hollow. João had long ago ceased to take pleasure in such things. Nothing could fill the emptiness that had settled in his heart the day his son, Felipe, died. Every Sunday, without fail, João visited Felipe's grave. It was the only time he allowed himself to feel the depth of his grief. At first, it had been raw, uncontrollable. He had sobbed openly by the grave, asking himself 1,000 questions that had no answers. But as the years passed, the pain had settled into a dull ache, a constant companion that whispered to him every moment of every day. The wealth he had amassed over decades had meant nothing in the face of such loss. Felipe had been his world, his only son, and nothing in João's life had been as important as that boy's laughter, his smile, his promise for the future. And now, that future had been ripped away in a tragic accident that João still could not comprehend. On this particular Sunday, João took a deep breath as he prepared to leave his home. It was a cloudy morning, the sky a muted gray that reflected the somber mood that had settled over João's heart. He dressed quickly, his hands moving mechanically, his mind already elsewhere. He selected the white lilies carefully, their petals soft and fragrant, and tied them with a ribbon, just as he always did. These lilies were Felipe's favorite, and each time João laid them on the grave, it felt as though he were somehow honoring his son's spirit. As João drove through the streets of the city, the familiar landmarks of his empire passed by in a blur, his offices, his properties, his investments, all the things that meant nothing to him now. The cold, gray clouds above seemed to mirror the emptiness inside him. The city, once bustling with life and promise, now felt like a backdrop to his personal tragedy. He reached the cemetery in silence, parking his car near the entrance. The place was peaceful, almost serene, with its rolling green lawns and rows of marble gravestones. It had been his sanctuary, the place where he could feel closest to Felipe, the only place where he allowed himself to break from his constant facade of strength. Today, like every other Sunday, João would sit by the grave, speak to his son, and allow himself a few moments of vulnerability in a world that demanded he be invincible. As João walked toward the family plot where Felipe's grave lay, a familiar chill ran down his spine. The cemetery was quiet, as usual. He passed the rows of gravestones, each one marked with names, dates, and epitaphs, most of them strangers to him, but some of them carrying the memories of lost loved ones, just like Felipe. But something felt different today. As João neared his son's grave, something in the atmosphere shifted. His eyes caught sight of a figure, a child, sitting near the tombstone. João's heart skipped a beat, his pulse quickening as he took in the sight of the boy. The child couldn't have been more than 10 years old. His clothes were ragged, old and worn, clearly a far cry from the fine attire of the children João was used to seeing in the circles he moved in. His face was smudged with dirt, and his shoes were clearly too small for his feet, barely held together by string. The boy was sitting cross-legged on the ground, his back to João, staring intently at the tombstone. João stopped dead in his tracks, confused. The cemetery was private, and it was rare for anyone to wander here, let alone a child. A pang of unease gripped him, but before João could move closer or even call out to the boy, their eyes met. For a brief moment, time seemed to freeze. The boy's eyes were wide, filled with a mix of fear and something else João couldn't quite place, an intensity, a kind of resolution that unsettled him. Then, just as quickly as they had locked eyes, the boy sprang to his feet, his expression shifting into one of panic. Before João could react, the boy bolted, running through the cemetery's perimeter toward the dense woods that surrounded the grounds. His small figure disappeared into the trees in a flash, leaving João standing there, rooted to the spot. What had just happened? Joao's mind raced. Why was this child at his son's grave? How had he found his way into a private cemetery without anyone noticing? And why had he been so startled, so frantic when their eyes had met? Joao couldn't shake the image of the boy's face, his wide eyes, and the urgency with which he ran. Something about the encounter felt important. Joao looked at Felipe's grave again, his breath catching in his throat. He hadn't even placed the lilies down yet. His hand tightened around the bouquet, his grip tightening with a growing sense of unease. He glanced toward the woods, the path where the boy had disappeared, but saw nothing. There was no sign of him, no trace of where he had gone. The rest of the visit felt distant, disconnected. Joao placed the lilies on the grave, but his mind was far from the serene ritual. He was consumed by the boy's sudden appearance, by the strange connection that seemed to pulse in the air between them. Who was that child? And why had he been at Felipe's grave? As Joao left the cemetery, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this was the beginning of something. That somehow, this boy was connected to Felipe in a way he could not yet understand. He had to find out. He had to know more. The week following the mysterious encounter at Felipe's grave felt like an eternity for Joao. The days dragged on, and his mind never strayed far from the boy, Samuel. The child's face haunted him. Who was he? Why had he been sitting at Felipe's grave? And why had he run away so abruptly when their eyes met? There was something deeply unsettling about their brief exchange, something that Joao couldn't shake. The boy's presence felt more than coincidental. His intuition told him that this child was linked to his son, and Joao couldn't rest until he understood why. In the days after the encounter, Joao found himself unable to focus on anything. His empire, his business dealings, his meetings, everything became a blur. The boy's image consumed his thoughts, and it was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore the urgency that pulsed through him. He needed answers. He had to find this child. He had to know who he was and what connection he had to Felipe. That afternoon, Joao called Marcos, a trusted private investigator who had helped him in the past with various matters of discretion. Marcos was known for his thoroughness and ability to uncover the truth, no matter how elusive. Joao knew he could rely on him to get to the bottom of the mystery. As the phone rang, Joao felt a tightness in his chest. He had never felt so desperate to understand something, so compelled to uncover the truth, no matter where it led. The image of the boy running into the woods kept replaying in his mind, like a broken record. "Marcos," Joao said when the investigator finally answered, his voice steady but edged with urgency. "I need your help. I need you to find a boy. About 10 years old, dirty clothes, looks like he's been living on the streets. He's been visiting my son's grave for months now, and I need to know who he is, what he's doing there." Marcos's voice on the other end of the line was calm and professional, but there was a hint of curiosity. "Understood, Joao. I'll start right away. I'll dig into it and let you know what I find." Joao ended the call and felt a brief sense of relief, but the gnawing questions remained. Why had the boy been visiting Felipe's grave? What was the connection? Joao couldn't explain it, but it felt like more than a simple coincidence. Something was tying this child to his son, and Joao was determined to uncover it. The next few days were a blur of anticipation. Joao spent long hours waiting, pacing the floors of his penthouse. He spent time in his study, reviewing financial statements and meeting with business associates, but his thoughts constantly drifted back to Samuel. Every time he heard a car pass by or a door open, he hoped it was Marcos with answers. It wasn't until Friday afternoon that Joao received a call that would change everything. The phone rang in his study, and when Joao picked it up, he immediately recognized the familiar voice of Marcos. "I have news," Marcos said, his tone measured but slightly strained, as if he too were taken aback by the information he had uncovered. "I found the boy, Joao. His name is Samuel. I traced him to an abandoned building on the outskirts of the city. He's living with his mother, Clara. They've been drifting from place to place, but I managed to get some information. There's more, though, something that might surprise you." Joao's heart raced at the mention of the boy's name. Samuel. It felt surreal to hear that name spoken aloud. This child, this boy who had appeared from nowhere, was now an undeniable part of his life, whether Joao was ready for it or not. "What do you mean? Something that might surprise me?" Joao asked, his voice tight with anticipation. Marcos hesitated before continuing. "Samuel and his mother, Clara, They've been visiting Felipe's grave regularly. They've been there for months, Joao. Every Sunday. And the most unusual thing, Clara, the boy's mother, said that Samuel has been drawn to the grave. She claims that he recognizes it, that he's been coming for a long time. They have no obvious connection to your family, but Samuel insisted on visiting the grave week after week, like it was a calling. Joao's breath caught in his throat. Felipe's grave. Samuel had been visiting his son's grave for months? It couldn't be a coincidence. There had to be something more to this. I need to meet them, Joao said, his voice firm. I need to know what's going on. Find out where they are and get back to me. I want to speak to Clara. I need to understand why Samuel is so connected to Felipe. Marcos agreed to follow up on the lead immediately, and Joao spent the next few hours mentally preparing himself for what was to come. He wasn't sure what he was about to uncover, but his gut told him that Samuel's appearance was no accident. The boy had been visiting Felipe's grave for a reason, and if Clara, his mother, knew something Joao didn't, he was determined to find out what it was. Later that day, Marcos called again. Joao, I've found them. They're in an abandoned building on the edge of the city, near the industrial district. It's not much of a home, but they've been staying there for a while. Clara seems to be keeping a low profile. There's something about her, Joao. She's cautious, and there's a sense of fear in the air. It's almost as if they're running from something, or someone. Joao felt a chill run down his spine. The mention of fear struck a nerve. What were they hiding from? Why had they been moving from place to place? The unease that had gripped Joao since the moment he saw Samuel sitting by Felipe's grave deepened. Whatever was going on, it was clear that there was a mystery to be solved, and Joao would stop at nothing to uncover the truth. I'm going to meet them, Joao said, his voice resolved. I need to see this for myself. I'll take care of everything. Later that night, Joao made his way to the abandoned building that Marcos had described. The streets outside were empty, the air thick with tension, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Joao parked his car some distance away, not wanting to draw attention. His heart pounded in his chest as he approached the building on foot. It was a rundown structure, its windows broken, the walls covered in graffiti. As he walked through the dimly lit corridors of the building, he couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding. When Joao reached the apartment that Marcos had pointed out, he stood in front of the door for a moment, taking a deep breath. He wasn't sure what he was about to face, but he knew that everything had changed. His life, his world, was no longer just about business or wealth. It was about this boy, this son he had never known existed, and the truth that seemed to be just beyond his grasp. He knocked on the door. Clara opened it, her eyes cautious but not hostile. She recognized him immediately, and the hesitation in her expression spoke volumes. Joao, she said softly, almost too softly. You came? Yes, Joao replied, his voice steady but filled with curiosity and something else, something deeper. I need to understand. The long, silent drive from Joao's penthouse to the abandoned building where Clara and Samuel were hiding seemed to stretch out in an endless haze. The uncertainty about what awaited him gnawed at Joao with each passing minute. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, and his eyes darted between the road ahead and the rearview mirror, as if trying to make sense of the world that seemed to be spiraling out of control. The cityscape blurred past him, a stark contrast to the quiet, dilapidated area he was heading toward. It was a far cry from the luxury and power that Joao had carefully cultivated over his life. This neighborhood, with its crumbling buildings and neglected streets, was foreign to him, a place where few wealthy businessmen would venture. But here he was, on a mission that was unlike any he had ever undertaken. When he finally arrived, he parked a few blocks away from the building to avoid drawing attention. The street was eerily quiet, with only a few stray dogs wandering between the abandoned cars. The air smelled faintly of decay, and the setting sun cast long shadows over the cracked pavement. Joao's heart quickened as he approached the building, a strange sense of foreboding hanging over him like a dark cloud. The building itself was a grim sight, a hulking, decaying structure that seemed to be barely standing. The windows were broken, the paint peeling from the walls, and the doors had been hastily patched with old plywood. It looked like a place where people tried to disappear, where they went when they had nothing left to lose. Joao climbed the creaky stairs to the upper floor, where Clara and Samuel were supposedly staying. The closer he got, the more he felt the weight of his own questions pressing down on him. What was this woman hiding? What did she know about Samuel and Felipe? And why had she kept this secret from him for so long? When Joao reached the top floor, he hesitated for a moment outside the door that Marcos had told him about. He heard muffled voices coming from within, too faint to make out, but enough to confirm that Clara was there, likely with Samuel. Joao could feel his pulse quicken, his body tense with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. What would he find on the other side of that door? He knocked softly, the sound echoing in the empty hallway. There was a pause before the door slowly creaked open. Clara stood before him, her expression unreadable, her eyes wary but not hostile. Her face had aged prematurely, the lines on her forehead and around her eyes deepened by years of hardship. Her hair was tangled, and she wore a faded sweater that looked far too large for her thin frame. But there was something about her, something resigned in the way she looked at Joao, like someone who had long ago accepted a truth she didn't want to face. "You came," Clara said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Joao took a breath, feeling the weight of the situation settle on his shoulders. He didn't know what to expect, but he couldn't let fear hold him back now. He had come this far, and there was no turning back. "Yes," he replied, his voice steady. "I need to understand. I need to know why Samuel has been visiting my son's grave. I need to know what connection you and he have to Felipe." Clara's eyes flickered for a moment, and Joao caught a fleeting look of guilt in her gaze. She stepped aside, motioning for him to enter. He hesitated for a second before stepping into the small, dimly lit room. It was sparse, the walls bare except for a few worn photographs and a small table that held some simple supplies, a few plates, cups, and a faded tablecloth. In one corner of the room was a cot where Samuel sat, looking out of the window at the setting sun. As Joao stepped further inside, Samuel turned, his eyes locking onto Joao's. The boy looked so much like Felipe, it took Joao's breath away. His face was a little thinner, his features sharper, but there was no mistaking it. The resemblance was undeniable. "Samuel," Joao said gently, his voice trembling with emotion. "I need to know why you've been visiting Felipe's grave. What is it about my son that brought you there?" The boy looked at him, his expression a mix of confusion and curiosity. He didn't respond immediately, as though weighing his words carefully. Finally, after a long pause, Samuel spoke in a quiet, uncertain voice. "I don't know," he said, his eyes dropping to the floor. I feel like I have to go, like something is calling me there." Joao's heart skipped a beat. The boy's words were hauntingly familiar. "Something is calling me there." It echoed the very feeling Joao had had the first time he saw the child at the cemetery. Samuel wasn't just visiting a grave out of curiosity or chance. He was being drawn there, as if some invisible force was urging him to return. "Do you remember how you first found my son's grave?" Joao asked, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and hope. He needed to understand. He needed to know if this was fate, or if there was something more to Samuel's connection to Felipe. Samuel shifted uncomfortably, his hands fidgeting with the hem of his shirt. "I didn't really find it. I just felt like I needed to go there," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's like I knew it was there, even though I'd never seen it before. And then I saw the name, Felipe, and I kept going back. I didn't know why." Joao's mind was racing. Felipe, the name. It didn't make sense. How could this boy, who had clearly not known Felipe in life, feel such a connection to him? And yet, here was Samuel, sitting in front of him, speaking of a connection that Joao had yet to fully comprehend. Clara, who had been silent throughout the exchange, spoke up quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "I didn't want you to know, Joao. I didn't want to tell you about Samuel. I never meant for any of this to happen." Joao turned to Clara, his expression hardening. "What do you mean? Why didn't you tell me about Samuel? What is going on here, Clara?" Clara closed her eyes, as though bracing herself for the inevitable. "I wasn't supposed to tell you. But Samuel, he's your son. Your second son." Joao's breath caught in his chest. His mind reeled, and for a moment, he felt as though the ground beneath him had disappeared. His vision blurred, and he stumbled backward, his legs weak with the weight of Clara's words. What? Joao stammered, his voice hoarse. "What did you say?" Clara's eyes filled with tears, and she took a step forward, her voice cracking. "Samuel is Felipe's brother. He's your son, Joao. I never wanted to keep him from you. But I didn't know how to tell you. I thought it was too late. The world seemed to spin around Joao. His heart was pounding in his chest, and he struggled to process the words that Clara had just spoken. Samuel is my son. My second son. He couldn't breathe. His mind, which had been so focused on the grief of losing Felipe, was now flooded with a new wave of shock, disbelief, and guilt. How had he not known? How could this have happened without him ever knowing? The room seemed to close in on Joao as Clara's words settled heavily in the air. Samuel, his second son, was sitting quietly in the corner, his wide eyes watching Joao's every move. His face, so similar to Felipe's, seemed to echo an unspoken bond between them. But the truth that Clara had just revealed hit Joao like a thunderclap. Samuel wasn't just some stray child visiting his son's grave out of coincidence. Samuel was his flesh and blood. Joao's heart raced, each beat pounding in his ears as his world spun. He staggered back a step, the weight of the revelation almost too much to bear. Samuel, this boy who had appeared out of nowhere, this child he hadn't known existed, was now a part of his life, a part that Joao could no longer ignore. But how could he have missed this? How could he have lived for so many years with the unshakable grief of losing Felipe, not even knowing that there was another child out there who was his son? For a long moment, Joao stood in stunned silence, his thoughts racing. The emotions swirling within him were too complex to unravel. His head was fogged with disbelief and confusion, his chest tight with a mixture of anger, guilt, and something deeper, an overwhelming sense of loss. How had he failed to recognize Samuel? How had he failed to be there for him? The guilt, raw and all-consuming, was almost unbearable. Samuel, Joao's voice trembled as he turned to face the boy, his eyes searching for answers. How did this happen? Why didn't anyone tell me? Why didn't Clara tell me? Clara, standing near the small window, took a deep breath before responding. Her voice was soft, almost apologetic. Joao, I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't want to bring this up. You were already so consumed by your grief over Felipe. I thought it was too much. And I was afraid of what this might do to you, to your world. I kept Samuel away from you because I thought he'd be a burden, something that would remind you of what you lost. Joao's eyes burned with the weight of her words. A burden. His voice shook with the intensity of his frustration. A burden? You kept him from me, from his own father, because you thought he'd be a burden? Clara, this isn't just about me. This is about Samuel. He deserves to know the truth. He deserves to have a father who can help him, guide him, love him. And I've failed him. His voice cracked as he turned to face the boy again, his hands trembling. I should have known. I should have been there for you. Samuel remained silent, his gaze fixed on Joao, but his expression was unreadable. It was clear that the boy was confused, lost even, caught in the whirlwind of emotions swirling around him. He had known for a while that there was something significant about his connection to Felipe's grave. He had felt an undeniable pull, a connection that went beyond the simple visitations he had made. But now, he was faced with a truth that had the power to change everything. Clara sighed, her shoulders sagging under the weight of years of secrets. I didn't mean to hurt you, Joao. I never wanted to keep him from you. But the world we live in, it's not the kind of place where people easily accept things like this. I was trying to protect him. Protect both of you. Joao ran a hand through his hair, feeling as though he were suffocating. The room seemed to spin around him. He had built his empire with unwavering precision, driven by ambition and the need to succeed. But all of that felt so trivial now. His wealth, his power, none of it mattered in the face of this painful truth. His son had been living just outside his reach for all these years. And now, he was here, standing before him, waiting for the love and guidance Joao should have given him from the start. I thought I was protecting Felipe, Clara continued, her voice breaking. I thought I was protecting you, too, by keeping Samuel away. But I see now that I was wrong. This isn't just about me or you. It's about him. He needs you, Joao. He needs to know his father. Joao's chest tightened, and he closed his eyes for a moment, trying to calm the storm of emotions within him. He didn't know what to do. How could he possibly make up for all the years that had been lost? How could he erase the pain and abandonment Samuel had endured? And yet, there was a flicker of something else within him, something that felt like the first hint of hope in a long time. Could he be the father Samuel needed? Could he offer the love and protection that had been denied to the boy? Opening his eyes, Joao took a few tentative steps towards Samuel. He crouched down in front of the boy, who flinched slightly, unsure of how to react. Joao's heart broke at the sight of the child's uncertainty. Samuel had been alone for so long. He had lived in the shadows, never knowing his true identity, never knowing the love of the father who should have been there for him. "Samuel," Joao said gently, his voice trembling. "I don't know how to make up for the years we've lost, but I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere. You're my son, and I'm going to make sure you have everything you need. I'll be the father you deserve." Samuel looked up at him, his eyes wide, filled with a mixture of disbelief and longing. For the first time, a flicker of hope passed across the boy's face. He took a hesitant step toward Joao, then another, until he was standing before him, eyes searching Joao's for some sign that this was real, that Joao truly meant what he said. Joao opened his arms, and after a brief moment of hesitation, Samuel stepped into his embrace. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't the smooth reunion Joao had once imagined. But in that moment, the weight of the years they had lost seemed to lift, if only for an instant. It wasn't too late. There was still time to make things right. Clara watched the scene with a mixture of relief and sorrow. She knew that it would take time for Joao and Samuel to build the bond they had lost, but she also knew that this was the beginning of something new. The truth had finally come to light, and the path ahead, though uncertain, was one that Joao and Samuel would walk together. The truth of the past, the revelation that Samuel was Joao's son, was more than just a simple unveiling of facts. It was a culmination of years of hidden truths, pain, and missed opportunities. Joao's world had been turned upside down, and with it, the entire framework of his existence had to shift. This was no longer just about his empire, his business, or his wealth. It was about a second chance, a chance to rebuild a relationship with a son who had lived without a father's love for far too long. For Samuel, the truth was both overwhelming and comforting. He had always known, on some level, that there was something missing in his life. He had felt the absence of a father's presence, the ache of longing when he saw other children with their dads. And now, as the pieces of his past began to fall into place, he was faced with a future he had never imagined. A future where his father was right in front of him, ready to claim him as his own. As Joao stood up, looking at the boy in his arms, he realized that this was the start of a long journey. It wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't be smooth. But it was a journey that had to be taken, and he was determined to walk it, no matter what. The drive to the outskirts of the city was long and quiet. Joao was lost in his thoughts, his heart racing with every passing moment. What could Clara, Samuel's mother, know about him, about Felipe? Why had she kept this secret for so long? When they arrived at the dilapidated building where Clara had been hiding, Joao's anxiety reached a new height. The place was a shadow of its former self, a crumbling structure that looked like it might collapse at any moment. It was the kind of place that someone would retreat to when running from something or someone. Samuel led Joao to the back of the building, where a small room was tucked away behind piles of old furniture and cardboard boxes. There, sitting in the dim light, was Clara. Her face was worn, older than her years, and her eyes were clouded with a mixture of sorrow and resignation. Clara stood as they entered, her eyes briefly flicking over to Samuel before meeting Joao's gaze. There was a long moment of silence as they studied each other, both filled with a sense of recognition and confusion. "You must be Joao Batista," Clara said quietly, her voice tinged with both caution and something deeper, something Joao couldn't quite place. "I am," Joao replied, his voice thick with emotion. "And you are Clara, Samuel's mother. You've known about me, and about Felipe." Clara nodded slowly, her face tight. "I've known for a long time, Joao. I didn't want to tell you. I didn't want to bring any of this to light." "Why?" Joao asked, his voice shaking with a mixture of frustration and desperation. "Why keep this from me? Why didn't you tell me?" Clara's eyes welled with tears, and for a moment, she looked away, as if gathering the strength to speak the truth. Then, with a deep breath, she finally looked back at Joao. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," Clara said, her voice filled with grief. "But it did. Samuel is your son." Joao's mind went blank. He couldn't process what Clara had just said. His pulse quickened, and he felt as though the floor had been ripped out from beneath him. What did you just say?" Joao's voice cracked with disbelief. His body was stiff, his heart racing. Clara stood silent, her eyes filled with tears that she could no longer hold back. Samuel, he's Felipe's brother. Your second son. Joao's world seemed to stop as the words echoed in his mind. Samuel is my son, Felipe's brother. His legs felt weak, and he stumbled backward, the shock too much to bear. He had spent 5 years mourning a single child, and now he was being told that he had another, an unknown son he had never known existed. Clara stepped forward, her voice filled with pain and regret. I didn't want to keep this from you, but I had no choice. Felipe, he wasn't the only child I had with you, Joao. Samuel, he's my son. Your son, too. Joao's heart raced, the reality of Clara's words sinking in slowly. His mind reeled, the memories of his past with Clara rushing back, fleeting moments, lost connections. The affair he had with her years ago had been secret, brief, and had led to Felipe. But he had never known that Clara had carried another child, that Samuel existed. You were both in my life for such a short time, Clara continued, her voice trembling. I kept Samuel away from you because I feared for his safety. I didn't want anyone to find out. But now you have to know the truth. Joao felt a tightness in his chest, his mind struggling to comprehend everything Clara was telling him. Samuel, the boy who had been haunting his thoughts for days, was not just a random child. He was his flesh and blood. His second son. Joao stood in stunned silence, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. The room seemed to close in on him, the walls pressing tighter with each new revelation. His hands clenched into fists, and for a moment, he thought he might collapse under the weight of it all. Samuel, his son, had been right there in front of him this entire time, and Joao had never known. He had been so consumed by his grief over Felipe's death that he hadn't even considered the possibility that he had another child, another life tied to him. Clara's voice broke the silence, soft but full of regret. I never wanted to hurt you, Joao. I never wanted to keep Samuel from you. But there were forces at play back then, things beyond our control. I didn't want him to grow up in a world where he was seen as an outsider. I kept him safe as best as I could. Joao's heart was pounding in his chest. How could you keep this from me for so long? His voice trembled, raw with emotion. How could you let me live all these years not knowing? Clara lowered her gaze, her hands wringing together in a nervous gesture. I thought I was protecting him. I thought I was protecting you too. Felipe was your world. You couldn't have handled knowing the truth about Samuel. I couldn't bear to see you in pain. But I was already in pain. Joao shouted, his voice breaking. I lost Felipe. I lost my son. His hands gripped the edge of a nearby table as if trying to steady himself. And you kept Samuel from me. I don't understand, Clara. I don't understand. Clara's eyes filled with tears, and she stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on his arm. I'm so sorry, Joao. I never wanted to cause you more hurt. But the past is the past. And Samuel deserves to know his father. You deserve to know him, too. Joao closed his eyes, his chest rising and falling with each labored breath. The shock was too much, too overwhelming. But the pieces were falling into place now. He thought back to the strange connection he'd felt to Samuel, the boy who seemed so familiar, the boy who had been visiting Felipe's grave every week. Now it all made sense. Samuel had been drawn to his brother's resting place, his subconscious searching for a connection, for something familiar. And Joao had been blind to it. As his mind raced, a deeper question began to surface. If Samuel had always been his son, why had Felipe's death shattered him so completely? Was it possible that there had been a part of Joao's heart that had already been split, torn between his love for Felipe and the unknown truth of Samuel? And more importantly, why had Clara waited until now to reveal the truth? Suddenly, everything felt fragile, delicate. Joao's empire, his wealth, his success, none of it could heal the brokenness inside him. But Samuel had always been there, waiting for him, and Joao had never known. Can I meet him? Joao asked, his voice barely a whisper. Clara nodded, wiping away a tear. He's been asking about you, Joao. He wants to know you. He wants you to be part of his life, if you're ready. The words hung in the air. If you're ready. Was he ready? Could he ever truly be ready to accept this new reality? To embrace a son he never knew existed? The following days were a blur for Joao. His life, which had once felt so certain, now seemed uncertain, full of questions that he didn't have answers to. He spent long hours alone, pacing through his grand home, staring out at the city skyline, contemplating everything he had just learned. Could he truly become a father again? Samuel was here, real, alive, and waiting for him. But how could Joao reconcile this new reality with the grief that still haunted him over Felipe's death? The guilt gnawed at his conscience. What kind of father was he to Felipe? He wondered. Felipe had been his only child, and he had failed him by not knowing about Samuel sooner. His heart broke as he thought about all the missed opportunities, the moments he could have shared with Samuel had he known. One evening, Joao found himself standing at the cemetery once again, the wind howling through the trees. He stood before Felipe's grave, the flowers from his last visit still resting gently against the stone. The guilt overwhelmed him, and for a long moment, he couldn't bring himself to speak. "I'm so sorry, Felipe," he whispered. "I failed you, but I promise you this. I won't fail Samuel." The promise felt like a weight lifted from his chest, but it also made him realize the magnitude of what he was about to do. He was about to open his heart to a boy he had never known, a boy who had already suffered more than most children his age. But in doing so, he hoped to honor both his sons, the one he had lost and the one he had just found. The decision was made. Joao was ready to meet Samuel. He was ready to embrace the second chance that life had unexpectedly given him. Joao arrived at the rundown building once again, this time with a sense of purpose. His heart was steady, his mind clear. He knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter in his life, one that would require time, patience, and an open heart. Samuel was sitting in the same small room, but today, there was a noticeable shift in the air. He looked up as Joao entered, his face unsure but hopeful. There was a moment of stillness between them before Samuel stood and walked cautiously toward Joao. "Samuel," Joao said, his voice soft but filled with emotion. "I know I'm late. I know I can never undo the years we've lost. But I'm here now, and I'm going to be here for you, no matter what." The boy looked at him, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and longing. "You mean it?" he asked, his voice trembling. "I mean it," Joao replied, bending down to meet Samuel's gaze. "You're my son, and nothing is going to change that." For the first time, Samuel smiled, an uncertain, hesitant smile, but a smile nonetheless. And in that moment, Joao knew that no matter how complicated the road ahead might be, it was a road he was willing to walk. The days that followed were filled with discovery. Joao and Samuel spent time getting to know each other, slowly building a relationship that had been long denied. Samuel, despite the pain and hardship he had endured, showed Joao a resilience he hadn't expected. The boy was intelligent, perceptive, and, most of all, eager to build a connection with the father he had never known. Joao, too, began to heal. The grief over Felipe's death was still present, but it no longer consumed him. Instead, it became a part of his past, a memory that he could carry with him as he moved forward with Samuel. He found joy in the little things, in teaching Samuel how to play chess, in taking him to the park, in simply sitting together in the quiet moments of the day. Their bond grew stronger with each passing day, and Joao realized that this second chance, this new beginning, was not something he had been given by chance. It was a gift, and he was determined to cherish it. As they stood together one afternoon, looking out over the city from Joao's penthouse, the weight of the past no longer seemed so heavy. Joao had a new purpose now, one that centered around family, love, and the second chance he had been given to become the father he had always hoped to be. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, Joao knew, with certainty, that the future held no